Welcome to the Bookish Hour with your hosts, Sarah E. Burr and J.C. Kenney. And we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Bookish Hour. I'm Sarah Burr.
And I am J.C. Kenney. And Sarah, it's Thursday night. It's Pie Day. We got adventure on the plate. I think it is totally time to get bookish.
I couldn't agree more, and I love adventure on the plate. Yes, it is, because as much as I wish I had a plate of pie next to me, I have the next best thing. We have a wonderful guest this evening with us. We are joined by E. Ambrose, who is the author of the Bone Guard series and just many, many works. And we're so excited that she's here to speak with us this evening. Chris, your books are hailed for being a Dan Brown meets James Rollins. And I'm not sure if you know, but they're two of my favorite authors of all time. So I'm super excited to dive into your work. I've really enjoyed reading the first in the series for the Bone Guard, series. And we're really excited for you to be here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah and JC. It's great to be here.
We're going to have a lot of fun diving into not only your characters and the settings and all of the wild things that happen, but the research that goes into these types of pieces, because they're billed as a archaeological thriller. And so I'm wondering if you could just share briefly with our audience members who may be new to you and your work, kind of your background and what brought you to your writing journey.
So I'm not sure I'm quite an adventure junkie, but I'm certainly intrigued by a lot of different levels of adventure, whether that's travel to exotic destinations or rock climbing. I have dabbled in scuba diving and definitely want to go back there, and some of those other things. And I'm also a history buff from pretty far back. So bringing those interests together to craft what I describe as knowledge-inspired adventure fiction gives me an opportunity to delve into history and archaeology and then discover strange things that people may not be familiar with and present those to my readers through an adventure, sort of hard-driving, action-oriented plot line.
I love that. I love learning through... I love learning when you don't realize that you're learning.
Yeah.
And especially reading The Mongol's Coffin, which is the first book in the Bone Guard series. It features around Genghis Khan's lost tomb. And how did you get the idea to craft a story and an adventure around this? And was it something that once you had it in your mind, you knew I can do this with other treasures and history, bits of history that I've come across and create a whole world around it?
One of my research interests for a while has been Mongolia, Mongolian history and culture. And that actually started when I was writing fantasy fiction. I took a workshop called the Odyssey Speculative Fiction Workshop right here in New Hampshire where I live. So it was exciting to have an opportunity that was that close to me. One of the exercises we needed to do was to do more research into the setting of one of our stories. I had come up with these characters in sort of a horse-based culture that was pretty invented at that time. It's my sister's into horses, I've ridden horses, I know some things about horses, so sure. And then when we were given this assignment, the obvious thing was to look at Mongolia, the classic horse-based culture going back for a couple of millennia now. So I started doing some reading on that, and I got really involved and ended up with a pretty good library of books about Mongolian history and culture, wrote some other short stories around that. And of course, the fact that the Genghis Khan's tomb has never been found to this day. And there are all of these interesting legends surrounding it. The idea that after he died, his body was brought back to Mongolia by this sort of secret caravan. Everyone who saw it pass was killed. Everyone who helped to create the tomb was killed. all of that sort of layers of excitement really helped to sort of build the mystery in the back of my head. So I kind of set that aside, worked on some other things for a while, and then came back to it sometime later after I'd had the opportunity to actually visit Mongolia and ride a horse across the steppes. Not for as long as I'd like, but maybe we'll go back sometime. And I had the opportunity to go to a concert of Mongolian music that was introduced by a local researcher who was talking about the history of Mongolian music and the kinds of things that they sing about. I was like, oh, I could use that to create a very unusual and very culturally specific kind of map. Mm-hmm. So that's how the Mongol's Coffin was born.
Wow.
That's cool.
That's so cool, because as I was reading it, and to kind of give folks a little bit of context about how the whole adventure starts off, you have a graduate student based in Boston that has found that there is a map in these old songs that she's discovered in the archives. And for reasons that I'm still finding out as I'm reading, you've got people that are coming after them, trying to get this map, but that's been blended into music. And I was just like, how did you come up with like this, like a treasure map in a song? I think that is so cool.
Yeah, because a lot of my work arises from the research and from the culture, it's important to me that all of the clues that are part of the map should be as invested in that culture. Mm-hmm. And when we were traveling, we did China and Mongolia together as one trip, which is perhaps not ideal, although the two nations are close together, but they have an enmity that goes back hundreds of years to the era of Genghis Khan, because the Mongols conquered China and the Chinese essentially haven't forgiven them yet. So that enmity becomes part of the backdrop as well for the Mongols' Coffin. I'm always looking for trouble. Where are the sources of conflict? Where is the tension in the society between the characters, within the characters? So that allowed me to build in some of that tension that we felt even just when we were traveling between the two countries.
Well, that's fascinating.
That is. So, and that kind of leads me to my question then. So when you're writing when you're doing your research, I'll admit, when I'm kind of learning about your books and Mongol's Coffin, I'm thinking, okay, we got some Indiana Jones, we got some Brendan Fraser mummy action going on. Those obviously set in the past as opposed to yours being more current. What are the challenges that you have in doing your research? You bring real things to the page, but yet they also need to be part of an entertaining story. Is that a challenge for you, or is it more like, oh man, I get to share this stuff? So can you talk about that a little bit?
Part of it is certainly driven by that impulse to share and go, oh, this is really cool. Like when we first traveled to Mongolia and then came back, a lot of people were surprised. Well, isn't Mongolia part of China? No, it's not. It's actually a democracy. They have been since 1991. So I was excited to share all this stuff about Mongolia that most people didn't know or had never thought about. But at the same time, if I took all of those books that I read and the places that I've been and pushed them all onto the page, the books would be 1,000 pages long, and they'd be incredibly tedious because it would be every detail. And instead, I need to learn which details will be most informative for the story. What do I need on a plot level? What do I need on a character level? And then which aspects of it would be striking or exciting to the reader because they'll be unfamiliar, or because perhaps it brings something familiar into an unusual setting, or presents it in an unusual way that they can get excited about. So research has been described as sort of like an iceberg. I need to know the whole iceberg, but what appears on the page for the reader is just that little tip. Oh. And hopefully that's intriguing, and maybe people go, oh wow, I didn't know that Mongolia had all those things, or I didn't understand that history. I didn't know that about Mongolian music. But mostly I hope they're going, wow, that was a really fun story. I can't wait to read the next one, and getting involved in the characters and the character relationships, wanting to see where they go.
I mean, I'm definitely, the characters are so much fun in the fact that like we know a lot about them, but yet there's still so much to be discovered. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind, Chris, just kind of giving our audience members just a little bit of a short, not bio, but just like a quick, rundown of who the main characters are that begin the Bone Guard series and whether or not they like kind of continue onward, and kind of why it's called Bone Guard to begin with, because I was like, oh my gosh, that's such a cool name, especially when I realized like why it was why it's called Bone Guard.
So there are 4 characters that are sort of the ensemble cast that continue through the series. They revolve around Grant Casey, who all 4 of them served in a group, the Special Forces Intelligence Unit, that's simply called the Unit. As is often the way of these things, it's pretty secret. And their job is to be first in, infiltrate a society or an area on behalf of the U.S. Army Special Forces, so that they can then provide ground information, intel back to inform other operations that may follow. And that's what they've been doing at the start of the book. It's actually prior to the foundation of the Bone Guard as a new thing. But what often happens in warfare is we find the intelligence, we know what could happen, and then the people higher up in the chain of command make decisions about it. So Grant Casey has information that this museum is going to be raided, and the brass says, that's okay, we're not interested. But he and his team decide to go in anyway. And they're essentially drummed out of the army after that, strongly urged to leave. And so he's sort of looking for something to do, as a lot of soldiers come home and are a little bit at loose ends. And was a history buff before he went to war. So he thinks maybe this is an opportunity. I've seen a lot of cultural artifacts being destroyed while I was overseas. So perhaps there are archaeological and sociologists and people who would like some support from people with a certain set of skills to defend expeditions or artifacts from the looters and the bad people out there. And when we meet him on the page, that prospect hasn't been going so well. He's presenting as very strongly military and kind of putting off some of the academics that he's trying to work with. So he's the lead protagonist, and he's backed up by his wingman, Nick, who is the guy who saved his life when they were in that museum in Afghanistan. And Nick is a powerhouse, but he's also been through a lot of stuff in battle, and he may not be entirely on a level footing anymore in terms of mental health. So Grant is aware, trying to support him, wants to work with him, but also some issues. As they put it, paranoia is one of the symptoms. Symptoms of what? Well, yeah. So DA Silverberg is their signals intelligence specialist, and she was originally assigned to the unit from another intelligence service. So she's kind of short, kind of sassy, definitely has an attitude about a lot of things. But the character they all love to hate is Goonie. And Goonie was the commanding officer at the unit sometime in the past. You don't know a lot about this in book 1, except that Grant is the guy who got him kicked out. So, but Goonie is now on the police force in Boston, which means when bad stuff starts going down around the graduate student and what she's found, he's the guy who's called in. And he's like, I can't believe I got to deal with you again. So he and Grant are at loggerheads from the very start. And it's an interesting relationship for me to explore. It's definitely one of the things that I hear a lot about from fans. They want to know more about Goonie, which is funny because Goonie's kind of a jerk and Grant doesn't even like him. But
yeah, like hearing you talk about the relationship, I thought it was so fascinating because it was, I guess, and maybe this is like my like cozy mystery author background coming into play, but usually your like lead character is a little bit antagonistic with the police force when they're, you know, when they're having an investigation, let's say. But the fact that like they like have this history, and yet he kind of inserts himself into this investigation that, you know, takes them across the Atlantic to England to do more research about these songs that may have a map to Genghis Khan's tomb. I just thought that it was something so new and refreshing that's like, oh man, like this guy's just tagging along for the ride. I love it.
You know, and one of the things that strikes me also is to kind of dovetail on Sarah's comment about, you know, when I'm writing my cozy mysteries, I'm in this tiny little town. It's a small community. We get to know everybody. There is certainly that element in your stories because you've got this small crew, but boy, you're taking them far away from the small town. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges in your storytelling involved with taking your characters, because like mine are all in this little fake town in Florida or fake town in Illinois or something like that, but you're going places far away. How has that been? Do you just make that up, or what do you do?
Most of those, some of them are places that I've had the opportunity to visit, which is great because then I've had boots on the ground. I've had a chance to look around and know what those places feel like. Some of them are not, so it's highly dependent on talking to people who have been there, maybe who lived there for a while, doing the research in terms of reading, watching movies, looking for people's travel videos and travel logs that they post online, often mention all kinds of specific details that I can use to build into the scenes and settings to hopefully bring them more to life. Oftentimes I'm looking in the footnotes of a more common text. I'll be going to the bibliography and saying, oh, that's the book I need to find. And it's some weird resource. I was fortunate to find a library that was willing to loan me a copy of a book that's highly specialized that was about the 12th century underpinnings of the city of Istanbul. And an archaeologist who had basically used all of the available information and then built a computer replica of what the city would have been like at that time. I was like, this is exactly what I need. So bringing together a lot of those resources and then hopefully bringing the scenes to life in a way that the people can picture themselves being there. They can hear the sounds. They can smell the food cooking. They can sense that they're close to the ocean, or that the grit of the desert when they're in the desert. And I'm aware that there's probably things that I'm missing, especially in the locations where I'm not able to go there. And there's always insider views that are different than outsider views. So hopefully people will get excited about the story and get invested in the places. And if the street doesn't go quite where they thought it was, or it turns out there's a staircase where I said there wasn't one, hopefully they will overlook a few things like that. I try to be as accurate as I can, and I know that there's always more to learn. Back to that iceberg theory, I can't put it all on the page.
Well, and I think we like to refer to that as artistic license. Well, one of those kind of things.
And with the
right.
with the action, I think driving so much, because I think we're learning by experience, because it's not like I haven't felt while I've been reading that I'm being told things. I'm living this action, and I'm living this moment with Liz. I'm living this moment with Grant, and like all the stuff that is around them. So from a setting standpoint, it's very like you feel like you're there. But then, and this is kind of a question that one of our viewers have, DHB was asking about the inspiration for like the technical aspects, like the military weapons and the sensors and like all of the, I guess, the tech that kind of goes into the archaeological side, but also like the bodyguard mercenary side. How do you do, where are you getting your information on those angles, or how are you making it as realistic as possible for the reader that's experiencing that?
Mm-hmm. The good news about special forces is that part of the training is to use whatever comes to hand. So my characters tend not to get caught up in, oh, I have a very particular firearm that I use, and this is how I always treat it, and this is how I always handle it. Instead, they're almost always improvising. So they're always looking for advantages they can take in the scene and in the moment that they're in. So that gives me an opportunity to really explore a lot of different angles and a variety of things. So that's kind of more fun. Sometimes I need something that's more specific, and then I'm going to the intranet. I'm going back to some of those specialized resources. For a couple of the projects, I have gone to the library and used a dark browser to look at websites that I don't want to have associated with my home computer.
Really?
Very smart.
Because sometimes I'm thinking, I need to know about this in order to be able to write about it believably. And I would prefer that the kinds of people whose websites I'm looking at don't know that I'm looking. Yeah. So
That's smart. That's good advice. And especially in, this day and age where it's like, everything's on the internet. It's like, being careful and covering yourself like that. That's very important.
Including sometimes some things that weren't intended to be on the internet. At one point, I was researching the mafia, and I was on an Italian government website and poking around. And I lived in Italy for a few months, so I have a pretty good grasp of Italian and have my dictionary and everything out with me. And I was reading some of this information, and then I navigated away to a different site. And I was like, oh, I should go back there. There's a couple other things I should find out. And when I went back to the site, a very large message appeared in the middle of the screen, a la, your computer is being hijacked kind of thing, only it was an official seal and all of the verbiage about things you are not supposed to look at and are not supposed to see. I was like, I guess maybe that was a door that was not meant to be left open quite as wide as it was.
That would scare me.
And I don't know if somebody sort of wait a minute, there's somebody's accessing this site that shouldn't be able to. Get IT on this job right away, close that door.
So when that happened, you didn't have a half a dozen, hulking figures and all dressed in black, like held down from the roof and escort you someplace in an undisclosed location, though, I trust.
Not so far.
Okay.
Now,
you're braver than me.
Maybe they showed up at the library.
So we've been talking a lot, Chris, about the kind of the plot and themes around the first book in the Bone Guard series, but you have 6 books out currently, and more to come, I hope. Can you share with us, I guess, a little bit about maybe or tease some of the other adventures or maybe other mysteries that Grant and the group kind of find themselves in, and maybe some of your favorite research stories from your other books?
Sure. So book 2 is called The Nazi Skull, and it was actually inspired by learning about an incident in Arizona called the Faustball Tunnel. During World War II, there were a couple of POW camps in Arizona for Nazi submariners.
Really?
The theory was that if we get them very far away from the ocean, even if they were to escape, they wouldn't be able to find their way back. These guys were known as super Nazis. They were believed to be extremely loyal to the Fuhrer, and the minute that they had gotten free from any other base, they immediately tried to return to the service. And indeed, that is what they did. They dug a tunnel underneath the bathhouse. They used some very interesting and devious techniques to keep that a secret while they were working over a period of a couple of months, and then escaped on Christmas Eve during a Christmas party. So the guards were distracted. They were having a nice drink, enjoying the meal, and these Nazis escaped. And some of them were lost in the desert. They were in the desert for up to 30 days. So the Nazi Skull is a little bit about what I think they were doing when they were out, and it calls upon my protagonist, Grant Casey's Native American heritage. He's Atono Adam, and some of the people of that nation actually helped to track down those Nazis when they escaped. So that was kind of where that story came from. Book 3 is The Assassin's Throne, and that one was inspired by an actual Byzantine automaton, which is the throne of Solomon. It was built for the throne room of the Byzantine Empire, and the emperor was supposed to walk up the 7 steps. It's based on the biblical descriptions of the throne of Solomon. But in this case, different mechanical animals would turn and react as the emperor mounted the steps. And it was said that only a righteous man could sit in that throne. So it sounds like a legend, but we know that it was seen. We have several travelers' descriptions of it, of entering the throne room and seeing this extraordinary device be activated by the emperor when he mounted that throne.
Wow.
And it was probably lost during the Crusades, when the Crusaders, who were, of course, supposed to be going off to attack infidels, instead turned on Constantinople, which was at that time Christian. Crusades, not good. So that was kind of where that one came from. And I was able to track down a very specialized resource. It was a young Italian scholar's doctoral thesis about the Throne of Solomon, where she had done a boatload of research. So that was a great find. Very, very handy.
How did you come across, I guess, like, I can't imagine like finding like a thesis to be able to like and have that kind of guide your work, because that's not something that like as a resource I'd be like, oh, like I should look in, what theses have been written about this. Like I think like that's just amazing that you found the inspiration in these different areas. That's so cool.
As I said, a lot of times it's the footnotes and the bibliographies for other books. So I think her work had been referenced by another scholar who was talking more broadly about the automata of the Middle Ages. And I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. So I looked her up and then was able to get hold of the thesis now that it's been published.
Wow. And
I don't know how many copies there are out there. It was kind of an expensive book, but absolutely worth every penny.
Wow.
Well, so that leads to my question. Like, how do you get these ideas? Because, you're talking about telling us these fantastic stories about something very specific, from anything that is, if we're lucky, only 80 years old to something literally thousands of years old. If I want to write one of my murder mysteries, all I have to do is go watch, TV for 20 minutes and I've got 2 dozen. But how do you come up with like the specifics to say, okay, yeah, this is something cool that I'm going to write about?
Lots of different ways. I read a lot of nonfiction. It always catches me a little aback when people are talking about like contemporary TV shows, or have you seen this, or have you done that? And most of the time, what I'm doing is reading nonfiction. Some magazines are really good for this. Archaeology magazine, Smithsonian magazine will frequently have recent scholarship. It's interesting to me how much history we're discovering in the vaults that we already have. So people going back to look at artifacts that were collected 100 years ago and nobody paid attention to them, or they're looking at manuscripts and we'd been interested in the first part of the manuscript and nobody noticed the fact that it was bound in parts of another manuscript. So a lot of these discoveries are kind of unfolding from inside the history that we think that we know. So when I kind of find one of those little tidbits, I will hang on to them. I have some envelopes actually stuck to the bulletin board next to me where I'll make a note and I'll pop it in. I'll dog-ear the page or, mark it off for later. I have little books where I sort of jot down ideas and then come back here and say, okay, well, what is going to be the next topic? Or sometimes I will get so excited about something that I immediately dive down the rabbit hole and have to see if I can find some resources about it. One example is actually, I just wrote a story for one of the upcoming issues of Thrill Ride magazine about my new protagonist, Nigel Rowe, where he's looking for the brazen head. So I got all excited about the brazen head because it was referenced in a couple of those resources about medieval automata. But when I started looking into it, I discovered that it never really existed. As far as we can tell, it was made up by a playwright in the 16th, 17th century, attributing this sort of mystic object to one of the earlier scientists, Roger Bacon. And I was like, well, that's kind of a bummer, because I had been doing the research thinking I was going to write a Bone Guard novel about it. Only the Bone Guard looks for real stuff. Like, I have to believe that that the thing that they're searching for actually existed, and that it's desirable, that other, bad actors also want it. And the brazen head wasn't real. But Nigel Rowe comes from sort of a different place and a different background. So when the new thrill ride themes came out and one of them was gadgets, I was like, oh, I bet I could grab the research that I had been doing and put it over here, and it can be something that Nigel is looking into instead, because he gets a lot more into sort of the fairy tales and the fables about the past, the legends, I guess, that aren't necessarily grounded in fact.
Can we hear more about Nigel?
So Nigel is a fun character to write, as the name would suggest. He's British. He is a failed academic and has been more or less expelled from his field of anthropology for misdeeds that are not yet specified. And he has decided to take his penchant for talking too much and making videos of everything he does and become a YouTube travel adventure sensation. So he follows up on tips from people around the world about some exciting or exotic thing that he should definitely come and check out. So the first book is called Blighted Mission, and there's a lot more humor in the Rogue Adventures books than there are in Bone Guard. It's still an adventure. I kind of think of them as cozy thrillers. So there's no cursing, if that's a concern of yours. Some people get upset because the characters in the Bone Guard are all ex-military, and there's cussing. There's going to be cussing. Most of my friends who are ex-military are cussing all the time, so that's what they are. There's a higher body count in the Bone Guard books, all that kind of stuff. So Rogue Adventures is a little bit more lighthearted, sometimes a little tongue-in-cheek, and a lot of that is just Nigel's attitude. It's sort of who he is. And in the first book, someone has tried to assassinate him. So he's trying to hire a bodyguard, and he ends up with a woman that when he meets her, he thinks, well, she's either exactly what I need, or we're going to kill each other. And it'll be fun to find out which. So that's sort of where his story begins.
I'm hooked already, because number one, cozy thriller. I'm like, okay, I'm here for that. But also I love things that have humor, and that kind of relationship where you're seeing sparks fly in an entertaining way.
Yeah, the genesis for that series had actually been thinking about what kind of relationship I wanted to have at the middle. And I'm using the term relationship not necessarily as romantic, but just in terms of the long-term association between these two people who might have very different personalities and very different ways of moving through the world, and what would make them stick together and what might sometimes drive them apart, and how might those different perspectives complement each other as they're trying to track down these historical mysteries.
And I tell you what, sorry, Sarah, we don't have nearly enough time for you tonight, EC. I mean, we could go on for hours and hours, and we only have a half an hour left, which is a bummer. But I've just got to say, you're telling us about Nigel makes me think of the Sally Hawkins film, I think, The Lost King, which came out, I think, last year, the story of the woman who literally found King Richard III and underneath a parking lot in Liverpool or something like that. It was just such an incredible story about, so many things, but also the fact that, we do have this lost history, or we have this history that we don't know about, sometimes literally right under our feet.
It's true. We might be driving over any number of lost kings.
Chris, you had said something that I wanted to dive in a little bit more when you were talking about thinking about how Nigel's relationship would play out long term, and this can be a question for both the Bone Guard series as well. But when you're, I guess, mapping out where you're going, is it book by book, or are you thinking about the characters themselves long term, or are the characters really the vehicle for presenting the latest historical mystery that you've uncovered? For me, the character development and character arcs come side by side with the historical mystery. Okay. And that's really important to me. One of my models in writing is Elizabeth George, with
her series, she has sort of her principal two detectives, and then there's a little constellation of characters around them, and those relationships grow and change over the course of the series. So even though each individual book is a new mystery, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that problem is solved by the end, sometimes well, sometimes poorly, and then we move on to the next book. But what happens in each volume changes the relationships between and among those characters. That's one of the things that intrigues me and that drives me as a writer, is that I'm constantly making discoveries about these people who until now have only existed inside my head, and now they're existing in the heads of many others, which is kind of a cool and freaky thought. So for me, that's definitely one of the engines. I don't necessarily, well, I'm going to say this, but then I immediately will prove myself wrong. I was going to say I don't necessarily think about planning out the character arcs too far in advance, but book 4, The Maya Bust, we know early on that Goonie is divorced and that it wasn't a good thing. In book 2, we discover that he has children that he's estranged from, and in book 4, one of those children gets kidnapped. So it brings Goonie's past and Goonie's relationships very much onto the stage and reveals a lot of things about him, about his relationship with Grant, and the way that he interacts with people. It was a lot of fun to write, and I actually wrote a lot of the scenes between Goonie and his daughter, whom he hasn't seen for a long time, before I wrote the actual arc of the plot, the external plot. And that was a very different way of working for me, but I could envision those scenes and how she was reacting to him, how they were interacting, and how those things would change. So I think I had about 17,000 words of that book written before I actually knew exactly what they were looking for and where they were looking for it. So that was a little bit upside down, but I do have some other areas moving forward. It's like, oh, I know that I'll be working with this aspect of their relationship. There are some mysteries from Grant's past that we haven't looked at yet, so those will be re-emerging in upcoming novels alongside some cool or exciting historical mystery.
Now, so JC and myself, we're both series authors, so we're writing in the same world, characters across many books, and I feel, and JC, I'm sorry if I'm speaking on your behalf in this, but like I know where my characters are eventually going to end up, and I'm wondering, Chris, do you have that sense, or are they still like are they still developing? Are they still just along for the ride for what is going to come, or do you have like an end goal in mind?
I'm not sure that I have an end per se. I have a few steps forward and a few steps after that. And right now I'm looking ahead to think, okay, which I've just ordered some of the research books that I'm going to need for the next Bone Guard book. But I'm going to need to sit down and sort of plan out, because I have 3 different books in mind, and which one actually comes next will depend a lot on those sort of character moments and where the characters are in their journey toward the next stage. I can envision myself writing these characters and enjoying them for many books to come. So, so is there an end stage? I don't know. It might not. Knowing me, my motto as an author is you do not want to be my hero. So, yeah.
I love that.
Okay, I don't want to be your hero. I want to make sure I say that right now, just to be clear. But one of the things that really makes me curious is how long does it take you to write when you get an idea? Like, okay, so you've got 6 books so far in the Boneyard, book 7. How long does it take you from like, okay, that first idea to completion? Because your books obviously have so much research and so much that goes into them. Kind of like what Sarah and I have said, since we write stories set in a single community, most of them at least, our research doesn't have to go nearly as far. typically as yours does. So therefore, we don't have to, our books don't take as long to write, presumably. So could you kind of tell us, maybe how long it takes you and how that process looks?
Yeah. Interestingly, what part of the impulse behind the Rogue Adventures novels was to try to shorten the time frame. So the first 3 books are the Bloody Baja group, and they're all based in Baja, California, but each one is a different story. So that way I could do a lot of research about a very particular area and then spin it out into 3 different stories and compress the timeline a lot. Because for the Bone Guard books, I've already been doing research. I have some of the reading already. I kind of know where some of the things are going to fit in. So there's a couple of months where I'm doing the reading, I'm looking for more things. If I'm going to travel to a place or talk to people who have been there, then I'll try to fit those things in. And that's typically during the tail end of the previous book process. So I'll be writing a book now that I'm working on that we can talk about later, which is a completely different thing. But now that I know where that book is going and have the outline for it, I'm thinking, okay, what is going to be the next thing? I can be reading my research in the evenings after I've finished my writing day. So that process is anywhere from like 6 months to a year. But the actual number of writing days in there might only be 50 or 60 days of writing. And it'll be all sort of compressed toward the end. So the cycles tend to overlap. I'll be doing the research and reading for one project while I'm writing and then editing another project. And then hopefully I will get the brainstorming and sort of plotting done. One of the handy things about those envelopes that I have on my bulletin board is oftentimes as I'm doing that research, I'll get specific little scene ideas or ideas for a clue. Oh, this is going to be a great thing that I can use to hook the reader, or here's a great location within my setting that I could use to set a scene. So I'll just write those things down on note cards or sticky notes, and I'll keep dropping them in the envelope. And sometimes that starts to develop into scenes between the characters. Goonie and Grant are going to be here doing this. Write that down on a note card, drop it in. Sometimes it's lines of dialogue. So by the time I've wrapped up the previous project and sit down to actually brainstorm the new book, I can take that envelope down and I might have 30 or 40 cards already in there to kind of give me a head start.
That is so cool. And folks, once again, this is another example of there's no wrong way to craft a book. It's all what works for you. And that's Chris, that's a brilliant idea. It never had really occurred to me to physically take the time, because I'm sure all writers get ideas for something else while we're working on a certain project, but to actually have envelopes or something like that and take the time to write it down and keep it, I tip my hat to you, because I'm not nearly that disciplined.
Yeah, it could be a file. Sometimes, I'll have a file going. If I end up following some of those research rabbit holes, then I'll start a file on my computer that's, I usually have a spreadsheet file for each book. So some of the notes will go in there. I might have a Word document where I'm just sort of grabbing pieces of text or copying quotes or writing down the authors and titles of books that I know I need to look for, or specific questions or things that I need to answer. So I'll sort of start keeping those documents going, and then switch over and look at them and say, okay, pull that out and see, what do I have? What kind of information have I already given myself?
I really like that idea. I think there's something to having like that, the physical aspect of it, because, I often type things just like on a Word document in my computer, but then you save that and it's like, where did I save it? There's no like visual reminder that it's there for me. So I really think that's a very cool way to begin to save and compile ideas. And really quickly, Chris, while we're on the topic of like the actual craft of writing, at the beginning of the show, you had mentioned that the inspiration for the Bone Guard series came from a writing course that you took. What had prompted you to go to that writing course, and like how did you get just the writing bug to begin with?
I have been writing stories since I was in about the first grade. I have these tiny little notebooks. The first one has Snoopy on the cover. Shout out to my friend Stacy. I don't know if she's watching live, but she was planning to. She's a big Snoopy fan. So it has Snoopy on the cover, and it's like 3-sentence stories that I wrote from almost the minute that I could write things. So creative writing has always been a thread through my background. I just figured I would have to have some kind of ordinary job to support myself while I was waiting for that to take off. I had a business for a while. I'm fortunate to have a spouse who can cover the mortgage and keep the household in funds to take care of everything in the meantime. So that's been working out pretty well. Where were we going with this question?
Just how you got, I guess maybe how you got to this writing class to begin with, and like, I'm going to write a book.
Right, the Odyssey class. So the first book that I started writing was from a different class when I was a sophomore in high school. I went to a summer program called Writing and Thinking. And I ended up writing a few scenes of a thing. When I started out, I thought it would be a short story. This is sort of the story of many authors, I think, would be accidental novelists. So, I'm going to write a short story. It's a fantasy story. There's like elves and, there's fighters and stuff and all these kind of D&D inspired themes. So I came home from that workshop with a few chapters, which I spent the next couple of years. I was a muse-driven writer at that time. So when the muse struck me, I would pull out the manuscript and I would write furiously for a weekend or a couple of weeks, and the manuscript would double in size, and then the muse would leave. And so I would put it away for however long it took for the muse to return. Now I sit down at my computer and the muse shows up for work. We come to work together, which is a better arrangement, I think. So that was kind of the first real writing workshop that I took. And when I heard about the Odyssey workshop, it was after I had left art school and sort of come home and was thinking about what was really going to happen next. And that maybe it was time to really get invested in this writing thing. I had finished the one book. Was it any good? I don't know. Nobody's ever read it but me and about 3 other people. But it was time to work harder and dig deeper. So that was sort of my opportunity to commit to the idea of writing possibly as a career, and not just a thing that I did periodically on weekends when the muse happened to show up.
Excellent.
And we're the beneficiaries of that decision because, you've got 6 books in one series, you've got 3 books in another, you've got all these short stories, and just fabulous writing. And we thank you for doing that. And we thank you for being here. And unfortunately, we've only got about 15 minutes left. So before we get to wrapping up, I do have one question for you. The Holy Grail, real or not?
The Holy Grail.
Yes.
There's something there, but it's probably not what people think.
Okay. So are we talking more Rogue Adventures, or are we talking Bone Guard for the Holy Grail?
That certainly sounds like a rogue adventure.
Okay.
I will chime in with a little fun fact, JC. So in college, I read the Da Vinci Code for the first time and was just like, it changed my life, and the fact that I went down this rabbit hole of oh my gosh, this is real. I was totally believing everything that Dan Brown wrote. I was there is this is a nonfiction book. I am here for it. And I changed my major. I added a major. I added philosophy and religious studies because I wanted to learn more about these the secrets of religion. And I wrote my freshman thesis was actually about the thread of the Merovingian line, and were Jesus and Mary Magdalene really married, and then I wrote eventually did Jesus die on the cross, and all of these crazy conspiracy things, and that was my life in college. I was totally there for that. So I was, if you ask me about the Holy Grail, I think it's a person.
Yeah, I was. See, there you go. I was very fortunate to be able to take a workshop with Dan Brown.
Oh my God.
Right before the Da Vinci Code broke.
Wow.
And Dan was a phenomenal teacher. we lost a lot when he moved away from teaching. And obviously, a lot of people are familiar with his writing and all the things that he incorporates there. But he was just a warm, charming, and amazing human being. And somewhere in my possession, I have a copy of the paperback of the first book. Ooh,
Angels and
title
Demons?
escaping me. The Angels and Demons. Thank you. It's kind of late at night for me here, for you too, I guess. But which is inscribed to me from him and says, "Good luck with your series."
Nice.
And I was working on a different series at that time, but yeah. And then a couple weeks later, the Da Vinci Code came out. He started getting death threats. People knew where he lived, and everything became very, very different. I'd like to be famous. I don't know if I want to be that famous. Maybe I don't need to be.
I think I've reached the point where it's like, you know what, I'm okay like not being that famous, because it just seems like more problems.
Well, and speaking of problems, like I said, our time is almost up. And Chris, this has been delightful. It's been educational, historical fiction, historical fact. Both are amazing things that I think we as a society don't spend enough time on. So, I thank you for all of your efforts in bringing, these fabulous adventures to us, and also teaching us a little bit at the same time. So kind of as we wrap up, Sarah and I always kind of want to find out what folks are watching, what they're reading, what they're listening to. So can you maybe share a little bit? You've talked about you read a lot of journals and a lot of different magazines. What else are you consuming these days?
So right now I have a new book of short stories called A Slice of Dark by Karen Hewler. Karen is one of my favorite short fiction writers. She writes very weird, quirky things, and any book of hers should be settled into, and then each story taken as a terrifying, creepy little delicious meal. So I am savoring that one kind of bit by bit. She is a lot of fun, and I'm not sure where she gets her ideas from either, but
You had
I'll have
mentioned
to ask her.
You had mentioned that you read a lot of nonfiction. For our viewers, if there were some very gripping nonfiction writers that you follow, or if they come out with something new, like who would you recommend folks look into?
Oh gosh, Curzon, the guy who wrote the Shadow Divers book, he's got I think 4 or 5 nonfiction titles out. Some of the greatest nonfiction people, they take a little longer to turn out a book. But Shadow Divers is the story of the finding of a lost U-boat off the coast of America. And it reads like an adventure story. He has another book that's called The Pirate Hunters. And then more recently, he came out with a book that is about the space race and astronauts, which I had another excuse to buy as a research title because I have a short science fiction novel out. So I needed to know a little bit more about astronauts for that. But if you're looking for an exciting nonfiction read, Shadow Divers absolutely can't
Awesome.
be beat.
That's a great recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah. How about you, Sarah?
What am I? So I've got a couple things that I am reading at the moment. Listening audiobook wise, I realized that it's been a long time since I've listened to Terry Goodkind's Sword of Truth series. And it's a long time because it takes a long time to listen to them on audiobook. I'm about, I think it's a 42-hour audiobook, but I only have 5 hours left, so I'm almost done. And I mean, I that's my favorite series of all time. Absolutely love it. The first one is Wizard's First Rule. And to your point, Chris, what you had said about, that Dan Brown had inscribed Angels and Demons for you and wished you good luck on your book. I vividly remember I was a part of some question and answer session that Terry Goodkind did during the launch of one of his later books. And I had mentioned, he was a big inspiration for my own writing and yada, yada. And, I remember him commenting, it's I really thank you for sharing. I look forward to seeing your books on a bookshelf. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that to me. And so that's like, I absolutely love his series, love listening to it. I'm also, for my weekly manga recommendation for folks, this one, I actually have the physical copy of it this time. It's called Watakoi, which translates to love is hard for otaku. And just for a little bit of background on it, it's about a group of friends who all love manga and like video games and stuff that I very much love, and how they have to hide it from everybody in their lives because people think that they're weird. So I'm glad that I can share my love of this stuff with you all, because I think it's funny that it's a comical manga. And then watching wise, still going through Star Trek: The Next Generation. JC, tonight we are watching The Measure of a Man, I think is the one that you had recommended.
Yes.
We're finally there.
Yes.
But over the weekend we had watched the Star Trek movies with Chris Pine that came out in the mid 2000s, and I was like, I forgot how much I really, really love them. I was like, why don't people talk about these movies more often? Because they're really fun and engaging. And I think it was because we had just seen Dune that I was like, oh, I got to watch these again. And I really love them. So those are good space movies, in my opinion. So yes, definitely. Someday, when we are not online, I'll have to share with you my opinion on Star Trek Into Darkness, the third of that series. And so I have thoughts, and we'll just well,
need more Godzilla. Everything needs more Godzilla. That's
yes, Godzilla, Oscar-winning film series Godzilla. And speaking of what we're watching, I watched the Oscars with my wife is a huge film fan, and had a lot of fun watching that. I want to send a little shout out to the last I can't think of the name. There's the Oscar, the short that won for live action feature short was about The Last Repair Shop is what it's called. And it's about the last repair shop in Los Angeles that repairs instruments for elementary and middle-aged school children so they can take music classes. And the LA Schools is one of the last, if not the last, school corporations that provides instruments to their kids free of any rental charges. And as the parent of a band kid, I just want to shout that out and recommend that to y'all. Also, Saturday night, went to see a local community theater production of Bright Star. And if you're not familiar with it, Bright Star is a musical that was written by Steve Martin and Edie Brickell. It is features a lot of kind of bluegrass music that Steve has played the banjo for years, and it's based on a part of the story of Bright Star is based on the true story of a baby that was found in 1906. Somebody had abandoned it and tossed it in a river. And so it was a lot of fun. It made its Broadway debut in 2016, which was also the same year that both Waitress and something called Hamilton showed up. So, so a tough year to make your Broadway debut. But if you get a chance, Bright Star, it was a lot of fun. The music's great. And so that's what I got.
Nice.
I do have one shout out for something I'm listening to, which is the Two Authors podcast. If you are interested in writing stuff, and they do interview a bunch of different people, but authors Douglas Pratt and Nicholas Harvey have put together this thing. They're just a hoot to listen to in any case because of that kind of odd couple relationship, which is hilarious. But they bring on various people, and Nick Harvey's background was in auto racing. So sometimes he has racing people on. They have people who live on sailboats and the kind of adventures that they have, and then a lot of writers and the kinds of things that they write about. So those are always a lot of fun.
Awesome. We always love getting recommendations from folks who visit us, and Chris, you've come with some really good ones, so thank you. Before we get ready to sign off for the evening, how can folks connect with you either online or if you're doing any in-person events that they can travel to? Where can folks reach out to you?
Sure. So I'm most active on Facebook. If you are a social media user, you can find me as EC Ambrose on Facebook. That's pretty easy to find me and connect. I'm at boneguardbooks.com is sort of the primary website. I did a redo on my website recently, and the Goonie took over. Yeah, he has some things to say. As I mentioned, he's not really Grant's buddy. So that was kind of fun to put together. So you might want to go there and find out why there's a coffee stain on my website. That's boneguardbooks.com. And I'll be lying low for the next little while in terms of public appearances. The next couple things I'm doing in person are actually fantasy and science fiction events.
Nice.
That's where I came from. So if you're in the Massachusetts area, ReaderCon is a great one. That's coming up in July. And ReaderCon, as the name implies, is all about the books. So if you want to come and geek out with science fiction and fantasy readers from all over the East Coast and beyond, ReaderCon is your place.
Oh my gosh, I should check that out, because I would hope
definitely.
that the Sword of Truth might appear there. I just love that series so much. Chris, this has been absolutely delightful. Thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful to meet you. It was wonderful to talk about your process, about your characters, about the inspiration, and about these wild adventures that both your characters and that you have had throughout your writing career. So we really thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you so much, Sarah and JC. I had a great time talking with you.
Wonderful. And for our folks that joined us live, as always, we really appreciate you sharing your hour with us here at the Bookish Hour. We will be back on March 28th. Our guest will be Molly McRae. She'll be joining us, and we will have a wonderful bookish time. Until then, make sure that you stay connected with us by either subscribing and liking to our channel, or you can visit us at itsbookishtime.com and sign up for our episode list so that you can make sure that you are notified when we have new guests coming on. So again, everybody, thank you for being here. Chris, thank you so much. And we look forward to having you back on the show when you have a new adventure to share with us.
Oh, absolutely.
Wonderful. Have a great evening, everybody. Stay bookish. Have a good one.
Thanks, folks.
Happy reading.